May 8, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Kozlov, 47, from Tula, stood on Kerch's eastern dock watching the third ammunition barge sink beneath oily water. German Stukas had found it 200 meters from shore. The barge carried 40 tons of 70-meter shells, enough for 3 days of sustained artillery fire. Kozlov watched crates tumble into the strait, each one representing another Soviet gun crew that would run dry when the Germans came. He'd been ferrying supplies across the Kerch Strait for 6 weeks now. Every crossing got harder. What Kozlov didn't know, within 4 days, his improvised ferry system would create the largest logistical bottleneck of the Eastern Front's first year. His attempts to evacuate 3 armies would trap 52,000 men without escape. The problem had started simple enough. Soviet High Command crammed 3 armies, the 44th, 47th, and 51st, onto the Kerch Peninsula that spring. Nearly 250,000 troops squeezed onto a landmass 90 kilometers long and barely 30 kilometers wide at its widest point. Behind them, the Kerch Strait, 4 kilometers of open water, separating Crimea from the Caucasus mainland. Ahead, German 11th Army under Erich von Manstein, veteran of the French campaign, architect of the Sevastopol siege. General Dmitry Kozlov, no relation to the lieutenant colonel, commanded the Crimean front from the eastern shore. His chief of staff, Major General Fyodor Tolbukhin, managed the nightmare logistics. Could they hold against Manstein's coming offensive? Soviet intelligence reported German divisions massing near Feodosia. The answer would come with devastating speed. The strait itself seemed manageable in April. Spring weather brought calm seas most mornings. Small ferries shuttled troops across in 2 hours. Larger barges moved tanks and artillery overnight. Command established a simple schedule. Military traffic flowed east to west in darkness. Civilian evacuations ran west to east after dawn. The system moved 4,000 tons of supplies daily, enough to sustain defensive operations. But sustainability assumed static positions. It assumed the Germans would attack slowly, methodically, giving Soviet forces time to establish defensive depth. It assumed wrong. The numbers seemed impossible. Manstein concentrated 150,000 troops against Kozlov's northern anchor at Parpach Narrows, a choke point barely 5 kilometers wide. But German 11th Army staff journals confirmed every detail. They planned to pierce Soviet lines in 48 hours, then drive east before reinforcements arrived. Senior Lieutenant Vasily Markov, 29, from Smolensk, commanded the 302nd Rifle Division's supply company at Parpach. His unit held positions along the northern coast where the peninsula narrowed to its thinnest point. Coastal cliffs dropped 40 meters to the Sea of Azov on his right flank. Inland marshes made the ground impassable for armor on his left. Every supply truck bringing ammunition to his regiment had to funnel through a single dirt road. Markov's orders seemed straightforward. Maintain 3 days of ammunition and rations for 8,000 men. Reality made that impossible. German aircraft hit supply columns every afternoon. Luftwaffe fighters strafed trucks on the coastal road, forcing night movements. Night movements meant slower delivery. Trucks crawled without headlights, drivers navigating by moonlight and memory. His company received 60% of requested supplies on good weeks, 40% on bad ones. April's calm weather ended May 5th. Black Sea storms rolled in, not unusual for early spring, but devastating for ferry operations. Waves reached 2 meters in the strait. Small ferries couldn't cross. Larger barges made the journey, but needed 6 hours instead of 2. The neat schedule collapsed. Military supplies backed up on the eastern shore. Troops waiting evacuation clogged the western docks. Major General Stepan Chernyak, 43, from Kiev, commanded the 47th Army, holding the peninsula's southern sector. His 3 rifle divisions covered a 40-kilometer front with minimal artillery support. Most of his heavy guns sat on the eastern shore, waiting for weather to clear so barges could transport them. Chernyak radioed front headquarters, daily requesting priority ferry access. So did the 44th Army commander. So did the 51st. Tolbukhin's staff tried establishing priority systems, critical ammunition first, then medical supplies, then rations, then reinforcements. Every priority system created new bottlenecks. German 11th Army struck May 8th at dawn. They didn't attack Parpach Narrows, where Soviet forces expected them. Manstein hit the southern flank near Feodosia, punching through Cherniak's positions with 170 panzers. His armor bypassed Soviet strongpoints, racing east toward the strait. By noon, German forward elements reached positions 15 kilometers from the western shore. While Soviet armies scrambled to redeploy south, Luftwaffe bombers found every ferry in the strait. They sank 4 barges carrying ammunition. They damaged 2 tugboats pulling equipment rafts. They set fire to 3 fishing boats converted for troop transport. Within 8 hours, ferry capacity dropped to 40%. That single attack multiplied chaos. Within 72 hours, Soviet forces fell back to Kerch City, compressing 3 armies into a pocket barely 25 kilometers wide. The entire defensive line collapsed toward the strait's bottleneck. Lieutenant Colonel Kozlov received new orders that evening: evacuate the 51st Army's artillery park before German panzers reached the coast. His staff calculated they needed 40 barge trips to move 200 guns across the strait. Weather allowed maybe 20 trips before the next storm system arrived. Mathematics made the mission impossible before it started. Kozlov chose to try anyway. What else could he do? Colonel Pyotr Bychevsky, 41 from Leningrad, arrived at Kerch's eastern dock May 9th with orders nobody wanted. The Military Council of the North Caucasus Front appointed him Ferry Operations Commander, a newly created position that made him responsible for evacuating 3 armies through a 4-kilometer choke point under German air attack. His engineering background qualified him for the role. His lack of naval experience meant he'd learned through catastrophe. Bychevsky spent his first 6 hours studying the strait. 2 main docking points on the western shore, Kerch City's commercial port, and a smaller military jetty 3 kilometers south. The eastern shore offered 5 potential landing sites spread across 15 kilometers of coastline. Simple arithmetic suggested shuttling loads between multiple embarkation points would maximize throughput. Reality complicated the math. What Bychevsky didn't realize, his systematic approach would create rigid procedures that couldn't adapt when German pressure accelerated. His ferry schedule would trap evacuation barges at overcrowded docks while troops died waiting to board. The ferry fleet consisted of 23 vessels. 12 were small boats, fishing trawlers, and civilian ferries capable of carrying 8,100 soldiers. They made the crossing in 90 minutes with calm seas. 8 were medium barges that transported trucks, light artillery, or 300 troops. Crossing time, 3 hours. 3 were large equipment barges that could move tanks, heavy guns, or 500 soldiers. They needed 5 hours to cross safely. Bychevsky organized the fleet into 3 groups corresponding to vessel size. Small boats would shuttle troops continuously, using 3 western embarkation points and 2 eastern landing zones. This distributed the load and prevented bottlenecks. Medium barges would operate on fixed schedules, 6 crossings daily, staggered to maintain constant flow. Large barges would move overnight, carrying vehicles and heavy equipment when Luftwaffe activity decreased. The system looked elegant on paper. Charts tracked every vessel's position, capacity, and estimated arrival time. Staff officers coordinated dock assignments to prevent congestion. Priorities determined loading order. Wounded first, then critical specialists, then line troops, then equipment. Radio links between shore stations maintained communication. How did this differ from earlier chaos? Bychevsky imposed structure. Previous ferry operations responded reactively. Boats crossed when ready, loaded whatever troops arrived first, docked wherever space opened. His system planned every movement. Before his arrival, ferry crews often waited hours for loading. Under his procedures, troops assembled in designated staging areas, moved to docks on schedule, boarded within 15 minutes. Average crossing efficiency improved 30% that first day, but efficiency assumed cooperation from variables Bychevsky couldn't control. Weather, German aircraft, panicking soldiers, deteriorating tactical situations. The numbers told a grim story. 3 Soviet armies contained roughly 250,000 troops on May 8th. Bychevsky's ferry system could transport 12,000 soldiers daily under ideal conditions. That meant 21 days to complete evacuation. German panzers would reach the strait in 4 days. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Kravchenko, 27 from Voronezh, commanded one of the medium barges. His vessel, a flat-bottomed cargo barge with a 40-horsepower tugboat, normally transported construction materials across rivers. The Navy requisitioned it in April and sent Kravchenko to the strait with minimal training. He learned ferry operations through trial and error, mostly error. Kravchenko's barge could carry 300 soldiers, or 6 trucks. Loading took 45 minutes. The crossing required 3 hours if seas stayed calm. Unloading took another 30 minutes. Then 3 hours returning empty. His crew managed 2 complete round trips daily, one departing at dawn, another at dusk. That schedule meant 600 troops evacuated per day per barge. 8 medium barges times 600, 4,800 soldiers daily from that class alone. But Bychevsky's schedule demanded 3 crossings daily from medium barges. Kravchenko tried implementing the requirement May 10. His first crossing left Kerch at 05:30 hours, carrying 290 troops from the 4th Rifle Regiment. Arrival on the eastern shore, 08:30. Unloading by 0900. Immediate turnaround. Second crossing departed 09:15, with evacuating wounded, 220 men on stretchers that required careful loading. Arrival, 12:15 hours. His crew hadn't eaten since before dawn. They grabbed rations while medics offloaded casualties. Third crossing departed at 1400 hours. German Stukas found Kravchenko's barge 30 minutes into that third crossing. The attack came without warning. His lookouts spotted the dive bombers too late for evasive maneuvers. 3 aircraft. They dropped bombs in sequence. First 2 missed by 20 meters, close enough to drench the deck with spray. Third bomb struck the water 5 meters off the stern. The explosion lifted Kravchenko's barge halfway out of the water. Metal shrieked. The flat bottom crumpled. Water poured through ruptures in the hull. Soldiers panicked, rushing toward the bow. Their weight tilted the barge forward. More water flooded in. Could anyone survive? Kravchenko ordered abandon ship. His crew threw life preservers overboard. Soldiers jumped into water that would kill through hypothermia in 15 minutes. The barge sank in 4 minutes, taking 70 soldiers down with it. Nearby fishing boats rescued 180 men. 60 drowned before rescuers arrived. The attack demonstrated what Bychevsky's elegant system couldn't account for. German aircraft controlled daylight hours over the strait. They hunted ferries like sport. Every crossing risked catastrophic loss. But nighttime operations created different problems. Captain Grigory Suslov, 38, from Moscow, commanded the Eastern Shore's largest landing facility at Chushka Spit. His dock complex could accommodate 4 barges simultaneously, 2 large, 2 medium. Proper lighting would allow continuous night operations, but lights attracted German bombers. Suslov operated in darkness, guiding boats through shouted commands and lanterns shrouded to minimize visibility. Night loading became a nightmare of confusion. Soldiers stumbled through darkness, searching for assigned embarkation points. Units arrived in wrong order. Wounded took precedence, but medical staff couldn't count casualties accurately in the dark. Barges departed partially loaded because commanders miscounted available space. 3 times that first night, Suslov's dock crews loaded 400 troops onto barges rated for 300. Overloading risked sinking in rough seas. Major Ivan Petrov, 35, from Stalingrad, served as Bychevsky's operations officer. His responsibility: matching available ferry capacity to evacuation requirements. The mathematics defied solution. By May 10th, Soviet forces retreated into a pocket 15 kilometers wide, centered on Kerch City. That pocket contained roughly 170,000 troops, frontline units, support personnel, civilian refugees. German forces pressed from three sides. The only exit pointed east across water. Petrov calculated best-case scenarios using optimistic assumptions. Weather remains calm. Fleet transports 15,000 troops daily. Germans maintain current pressure without intensifying attacks. Evacuation requires 12 days. Luftwaffe activity stays moderate. Acceptable losses: maybe 10% of ferry capacity. Every assumption proved wrong. Resistance within military councils complicated everything. Colonel General Dmitry Kozlov, front commander, insisted on evacuating heavy equipment alongside troops. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, all represented irreplaceable assets. Destroying them meant weakening future defensive capacity. His chief of staff, Tolbukin, argued for prioritizing personnel. Equipment could be replaced. Trained soldiers couldn't. The debate consumed hours while German panzers advanced. Senior officers also competed for ferry priority. Each army commander demanded his units receive preference. The 44th Army held northern positions under heaviest German pressure. Surely their exhausted divisions needed evacuation first. But the 51st Army occupied southern sectors where German armor penetrated deepest. Their formations faced encirclement. Didn't they require immediate extraction? And the 47th Army anchored the center. Withdrawing them created holes in the defensive line. Every argument had merit. Every decision created resentment. While generals debated, Bychevsky modified his system. He established priority tiers. Tier 1, wounded and medical staff. Tier 2, artillery crews, trained specialists valuable enough to justify leaving guns behind. Tier 3, infantry regiments reduced below 40% strength. Tier 4, support personnel. Tier 5, equipment, weapons, supplies. Everything else got destroyed before Germans captured it. The priority system generated immediate pushback. Why should support troops wait while infantry evacuated? Supply officers, engineers, communications specialists. They couldn't defend positions, but armies couldn't function without them. Tank crews protested leaving their T-34s on the beach. Those machines represented months of training, combat experience with specific vehicles. And what about political officers? Some commissars demanded priority boarding based on party rank. Others insisted on staying with their units, regardless of evacuation order. Bychevsky ignored most complaints. His system continued operating despite opposition because no better alternative existed. By May 11th, his ferries evacuated 18,000 troops. Better than predicted, worse than necessary. Then weather destroyed the mathematics entirely. May 12th brought storms that turned the Kerch Strait into a killing zone. Winds reached 40 kilometers per hour. Waves crested at 3 meters, high enough to swamp medium barges, dangerous enough to ground the entire ferry fleet. Captain Suslov watched from Chushka Spit as whitecaps marched across the strait. No crossings today. Maybe not tomorrow either. 12,000 troops waited on Kerch's docks. They'd assembled through the night, marching from defensive positions under German artillery fire. Now they stood exposed on open beaches while Stukas hunted. The first air raid came at 0730 hours. German bombers dropped ordnance on packed formations that couldn't scatter fast enough. Casualties reached 300 before noon. Senior Lieutenant Markov's 302nd Rifle Division Supply Company retreated to Kerch that morning. His unit had abandoned positions at Parpach Narrows after German armor broke through southern defenses. The retreat covered 40 kilometers in darkness, units stumbling along coastal roads, losing stragglers to exhaustion and confusion. Markov reached the evacuation zone with 340 men from an original complement of 480. Where the others went, he couldn't say. Dead, captured, scattered during night movements, his company joined the evacuation queue at 600 hours. By 1400, they'd advanced 200 meters toward the docks. The line barely moved. Soldiers ahead refused to budge without orders. Officers shouted contradictory commands. Someone started a rumor that large barges would arrive after dark. Better to wait than risk the small fishing boats. The rumor spread despite having no basis. Thousands of troops simply stopped moving forward. Could Bychevsky's rigid schedules accommodate chaos like this? The answer emerged through brutal trial. What Markov observed that afternoon would reshape Soviet evacuation doctrine. Desperation made discipline collapse faster than enemy action. Soldiers who'd held positions under fire for weeks broke psychologically when escape seemed possible, but remained out of reach. By evening, German forward elements reached positions 4 kilometers from Kerch's western outskirts. Artillery observers called fire missions on the evacuation beaches. Shells began falling at 1900 hours. Not concentrated barrages, just sporadic fire that kept troops pinned and terrified. 3 rounds landed among soldiers waiting near the southern jetty. Body parts scattered across 50 meters. Survivors panicked, rushing the docks. Guards tried restoring order. Soldiers overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. 2 small ferries sat at the military jetty that moment, each capable of carrying 80 troops. Panicking soldiers jammed aboard until decks groaned under weight. The first boat took on 140 men before its captain physically fought off additional boarders. He cast off immediately, fearing his vessel would capsize at the dock. The second ferry's crew showed less courage. They loaded 190 soldiers, more than double safe capacity, then attempted departure. The overloaded boat cleared the dock by 10 meters before settling low in the water. Waves washed over the gunwales. Water flooded the engine compartment. The ferry wallowed, then slowly sank in shallow water close enough to shore that most soldiers waded to safety. Most, not all. Lieutenant Colonel Kozlov, the supply officer who'd watched barges sink a week earlier, tried implementing crowd control at the commercial port. His solution involved armed guards and threat of force. Anyone breaking queue order would be shot. The threat worked for 6 hours. Then German artillery found the port's main warehouse. The building contained medical supplies, rations, and ammunition, all waiting transport across the strait. A shell penetrated the roof and detonated inside. The resulting explosion destroyed the warehouse and killed 80 soldiers sheltering nearby. Fire spread to adjacent structures. Dense smoke made breathing difficult across half the port. Soldiers broke and ran. Kozlov's guards fired warning shots. Nobody stopped. Troops streamed toward the docks in a human wave, climbing over barriers, pushing through checkpoints. 3 barges waited at the commercial pier. 1 large, 2 medium. Soldiers swarmed aboard, all 3 simultaneously. The large barge, built to carry 500 men, took on 800. Troops hung from railings, crammed into every available space. The barge's captain tried objecting. His crew couldn't physically prevent boarding. They departed 15 minutes later, riding dangerously low. The crossing took 7 hours instead of 5. Rough seas and overloading forced reduced speed. The barge reached Chushka Spit at 300 hours. Captain Suslov's dock crews needed 2 hours to offload 800 exhausted, traumatized soldiers in darkness. Many could barely walk after standing crushed together for 7 hours. Medical personnel treated 40 cases of severe dehydration and 3 crushed ribs. How many more crossings could the fleet sustain under these conditions? Bychevsky's staff calculated losses and capacity degradation. Since May 8th, German aircraft sank or damaged than 30% of available vessels. Remaining boats operated beyond safe parameters. Crews worked 20-hour shifts without adequate rest. Maintenance got deferred because nobody had time for repairs. Minor mechanical problems became major failures. One tugboat's engine seized May 13th due to oil starvation. The chief engineer hadn't checked levels in 4 days. Another barge developed hull cracks that would normally require immediate dry dock. Instead, crews stuffed the leaks with canvas and continued operations. Major Petrov, Bychevsky's operations officer, assembled casualty statistics that revealed the ferry system's true cost. Through May 13th, 31,000 troops evacuated successfully. But 2,400 died in sinkings, 800 drowned in overloading accidents, 200 killed by German air attacks on evacuation beaches. That meant 4,400 casualties directly attributable to the evacuation itself, roughly 12% of everyone who reached the eastern shore. Those numbers excluded soldiers killed during retreat to Kerch, or those trapped when defensive positions collapsed, or civilians caught in crossfire. The statistics raised grim questions. Was evacuation worth the cost? Would defending Kerch to the last round result in fewer total casualties? Nobody wanted to calculate that mathematics. Weather cleared May 14th. Bychevsky immediately increased ferry operations to maximum capacity. Every available boat crossing continuously from dawn until dusk. Small vessels made 5 round trips. Medium barges managed 3. Large barges completed 2 overnight crossings. The intensified schedule moved 22,000 troops in 24 hours, the highest single-day total of the entire evacuation. But higher throughput attracted German attention. Luftwaffe bombers appeared over the strait in greater numbers than previous days. They attacked in waves throughout daylight hours. Fighter escorts meant Soviet aircraft couldn't intercept effectively. The Germans sank 3 fishing boats, damaged 2 medium barges severely enough to require withdrawal from service, and killed 900 soldiers waiting at embarkation points. One Stuka attack struck a large barge mid-crossing. The bomb hit directly, breaking the vessel's back. It sank in less than 2 minutes. 480 soldiers drowned. Only 40 survived. Captain Kravchenko, the medium barge commander who'd survived an earlier attack, watched that sinking from his own vessel 500 meters away. His crew could do nothing. By the time they reached the debris field, no survivors remained visible. Bodies floated in spreading oil slicks. Kravchenko continued his scheduled crossing. What else could he do? Stopping meant failing to evacuate 300 troops depending on his barge. That evening, Colonel Bychevsky modified operations again. All ferries would cross at night only. Daylight operations caused unacceptable losses. The change cut daily capacity by 40%. Night crossings required more time. Reduced visibility prevented efficient loading. Darkness made navigation dangerous. But survival rates improved. German bombers rarely attacked at night. Soviet fighters couldn't provide daytime escort, but darkness offered protection enemy fighters couldn't penetrate. The shift to night operations created new problems. Loading procedures that worked poorly in darkness became complete chaos when rushed. Embarkation schedules fell apart when units arrived late or in wrong order. Soldiers waiting overnight faced German artillery without shelter. Desertion increased. Troops abandoned their units rather than stand exposed for 12 hours before boarding. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Kravchenko proposed a solution during a staff meeting, May 15th. His idea: stage troops in covered positions away from the docks, then move them forward in groups timed to specific ferry arrivals. Rather than having thousands wait on open beaches, most soldiers would shelter in Kerch's ruins until their assigned departure approached. The system required precise coordination between staging officers and ferry commanders, but it minimized exposure. Bychevsky approved the concept. Implementation began immediately. Staff officers divided waiting units into departure groups numbered 1 through 60. Each group contained 400, 500 soldiers. Messengers would alert groups 2 hours before their scheduled boarding time. Groups would march to docks, board quickly, depart. Next group would already be moving forward as previous groups embarked. The staging system worked better than expected for the first 2 nights. Troops sheltered in bombed-out buildings instead of standing exposed. Embarkation proceeded more smoothly when soldiers arrived in organized groups rather than milling crowds. Ferry crews appreciated predictable schedules. They knew exactly when to arrive, at which dock, how many troops to expect, when to depart. Then German forces reached Kerch's outskirts, and the entire system collapsed under fire. Colonel Friedrich Schultz, 46 commander of the 46th Infantry Division's Forward Regiment, observed Kerch through binoculars from a hilltop 3 kilometers west. German forces had advanced faster than Manstein planned. His troops covered 80 kilometers in 6 days, crushing Soviet defensive positions through aggressive maneuver and concentrated armor. Now they stood on high ground, overlooking the final pocket. Schultz counted dozens of vessels in the strait below. Some appeared stationary at docks. Others crossed toward the eastern shore in slow-moving lines. Every boat represented Soviets escaping the trap. He radioed artillery coordinates. German 105mm guns opened fire within minutes. The barrage caught staging groups moving toward embarkation points. Shells landed among columns, marching through Kerch's streets at 2130 hours, May 16th. Lieutenant Colonel Kozlov's supply company, waiting in a group scheduled for midnight departure, took direct hits. 3 shells detonated in the courtyard where his troops assembled. The explosions killed 60 men instantly and wounded 90 more. Kozlov survived, but shrapnel severed his left arm below the elbow. Medics applied tourniquets. His company stopped existing as an organized unit. Could Bychevsky's staging system function when German artillery ranged every street leading to the docks? Reality provided the answer through escalating casualties. Artillery fire transformed Kerch into hell. Shells fell randomly across the shrinking Soviet pocket. Nobody stayed safe in staging areas. Those positions came under fire as frequently as the docks themselves. Officers stopped trying to implement organized departures. They simply moved troops forward whenever breaks in shelling allowed. Coordination collapsed. Groups arrived at embarkation points in wrong order, at wrong times, in greater numbers than expected. The evacuation became a race between German guns and Soviet desperation. Ferry commanders loaded whoever reached their vessels first, regardless of schedules or assigned groups. Capacity limits got ignored. Small boats designed for 80 soldiers departed with 120. Medium barges rated at 300 carried 450. Nobody refused boarding. Turning desperate soldiers away seemed crueler than risking overload. Captain Grigory Suslov, commanding the Eastern Shore's receiving facility, watched boats arrive throughout that night. Many rode so low that waves washed across their decks. Soldiers clung to railings, to each other, to anything that might prevent them sliding into the water if their vessel rolled. One fishing boat appeared shortly after midnight, carrying 150 troops on a hull built for 60. The captain beached his vessel rather than attempting to dock. He couldn't maneuver safely with that much weight distributed so poorly. Troops waded ashore through chest-deep water. Suslov's dock crews worked without rest. Offload one barge, immediately prepare for the next arrival. No time for maintenance, repairs, or organizing received troops. Evacuated soldiers simply moved inland from the docks, away from the strait, beyond German artillery range. Some units maintained organization. Most dissolved into streams of individuals wandering east. At 0340 hours, a medium barge arrived at Suslov's dock, so overloaded it scraped bottom entering shallow water. The vessel carried 520 soldiers, nearly double its rated capacity. Troops covered every surface. Some stood in the open hold, packed so tightly they couldn't sit. Others sat on the engine housing, the gunwales, the bow platform. The barge's freeboard, the distance from waterline to deck, measured less than 30 centimeters. Normal freeboard exceeded 1 meter. Suslov's crews couldn't offload quickly enough. The barge sat dangerously low and couldn't withdraw until weight lifted off. But 520 men couldn't disembark in minutes. They climbed off in chaotic disorder, pushing, shoving, desperate to reach solid ground. The process took 40 minutes. By the time the last soldier stepped onto the dock, dawn approached. German aircraft would return with first light. Throughout that night, Bychevsky's ferries evacuated 16,000 troops, but German forces tightened their grip on Kerch. By morning, May 17th, Soviet defenders held only the city's eastern districts and a strip of coastline 3 kilometers wide. Approximately 90,000 soldiers remained trapped in that pocket. Simple arithmetic made the situation clear. Even operating at maximum capacity, Bychevsky's ferry system needed 6 more days to evacuate remaining forces. German pressure would eliminate the pocket in two. What choice remained? Front Commander Kozlov ordered a final stand. Selected units would defend Kerch to the last round, buying time for as many troops as possible to escape. Other formations would fall back to embarkation points immediately, abandoning all equipment. The defense lasted 18 hours. Dawn brought Luftwaffe bombers in unprecedented numbers. They attacked continuously from 600 until sunset. Waves of Stukas hitting ferry docks, embarkation beaches, vessels in the strait. German fighters strafed Soviet positions in Kerch's ruins. The bombing created firestorms in districts where wooden structures still stood. Smoke reduced visibility to less than 50 meters across much of the city. Senior Lieutenant Markov, the supply officer whose company had been shattered by artillery, found himself commanding a scratch force of 180 men from 4 different units. None of the soldiers knew each other. Most had abandoned their weapons during retreat. Markov armed them with rifles, scavenged from the dead, and positioned them in buildings overlooking the main road to the commercial port. His orders: hold until dusk, then withdraw to the docks. German infantry appeared at 1100 hours. They advanced cautiously, expecting strong resistance. Markov's force fired from concealment, then immediately displaced to alternate positions. The tactic created the impression of larger numbers. German troops called artillery support. Shells demolished the buildings Markov's men had just vacated. The delaying action bought 3 hours before German forces realized they faced a scratch force, not organized defenders. By 1400 hours, Markov couldn't hold any longer. His force had suffered 40 casualties. Ammunition ran critically low. Soldiers fired single shots instead of wasting rounds on suppressive fire. He ordered withdrawal toward the docks. His survivors reached the embarkation area at 1530 hours. 20,000 troops already waited there. The queue extended 2 kilometers back from the waterfront. How could ferry operations continue with German forces this close? Bychevsky made a desperate decision. Operate in daylight despite aircraft. Load continuously regardless of losses. Evacuate until German troops physically seized the docks. At 1620 hours, 3 large barges arrived simultaneously at Kerch's commercial port. Each could carry 500 soldiers. Waiting troops surged forward. Guards tried, maintaining order. Crowds overwhelmed them through sheer mass. Soldiers climbed aboard from every direction, over railings, through cargo doors, across connecting ramps from adjacent docks. Officers lost control. The barges loaded to triple capacity within minutes. The first barge departed at 1635 hours, carrying roughly 1,400 troops. It cleared the dock by 100 meters before German artillery observers spotted it. Shells began falling. The first rounds missed. Range finding. Corrections came quickly. A 105mm shell hit the barge's portside amidships. The explosion tore a hole below the waterline. Water flooded in. The barge listed 15 degrees to port, then 30 degrees. Overloaded and unbalanced, it capsized in less than 3 minutes. 1,400 soldiers went into the water. Most couldn't swim. They'd grown up in inland regions where swimming meant rivers and lakes, not open water. Their uniforms soaked through, dragging them down. Boots filled with water. Equipment pulled them under. Hundreds drowned within sight of the docks they'd just departed. Nearby vessels rescued 300 men. The rest died. The second and third barges witnessed the catastrophe and continued crossing anyway. What else could they do? Turning back meant failing to evacuate 2,000 troops, depending on those vessels. Both barges made the crossing successfully, arriving at Chushka Spit by 1900 hours. German aircraft attacked during the journey but missed their targets. As darkness fell May 17th, German infantry pushed into Kerch's eastern districts. Street fighting erupted in ruins where Soviet rear guards made their stand. Rifle fire echoed through smoke-filled streets. The evacuation continued through chaos. Ferries arriving, loading whoever reached them, departing under fire. Organizations ceased to exist. Survival became individual rather than collective. Captain Kravchenko made his final crossing that night. His medium barge departed Kerch at 2340 hours, with 380 soldiers crammed aboard. German small arms fire rattled against the hull as his vessel pulled away from the dock. Tracer rounds arced across the water. One bullet struck Kravchenko's shoulder, a through-and-through wound that bled freely but missed bone and major arteries. He maintained command during the crossing, arriving at Chushka Spit at 0230 hours, May 18th. By dawn, German forces controlled Kerch's waterfront. The evacuation ended. Approximately 120,000 Soviet troops escaped across the strait during the 10-day operation. Nearly 130,000 remained trapped in the pocket. Most surrendered May 18-19 after exhausting their ammunition. Some attempted swimming the strait, a suicidal effort given the distance and cold water. German forces reported finding bodies washing ashore for days afterward. The catastrophe reached its final phase in those last desperate hours. Soldiers who'd fought disciplined defensive actions for weeks broke psychologically when escape became impossible. Some shot themselves, rather than face capture. Others threw down their weapons and walked toward German lines with hands raised. A few hundred attempted a breakout west, a hopeless effort that ended in annihilation by German machine guns. Lieutenant Colonel Kozlov, the supply officer who'd initiated the ferry crisis, through his attempts at systematic evacuation, died on the dock he'd managed for 10 days. German artillery struck his position during final loading operations. Shrapnel killed him instantly. He never learned whether his efforts saved more soldiers than his rigid procedures trapped. Between May 8 and May 18, 1942, Bychevsky's ferry system evacuated 119,000 Soviet troops from the Kerch Peninsula. But the operation cost 52,000 casualties directly attributable to evacuation failures. Soldiers killed in sinkings, drownings, air attacks on embarkation points, and artillery strikes on overcrowded vessels. This represented a 30% casualty rate for forces that reached evacuation zones, far exceeding losses from direct combat during the retreat. The numbers revealed systematic failures. German forces could have inflicted those 52,000 casualties through sustained combat operations, requiring weeks of fighting and significant German losses. Instead, Soviet logistical dysfunction created a catastrophe where their own evacuation procedures killed troops faster than enemy action. How did one colonel's rigid ferry schedules multiply chaos rather than prevent it? The answer lay in misunderstanding the fundamental nature of evacuation under pressure. Bychevsky designed procedures for orderly withdrawal. Reality demanded adaptive chaos management. Traditional military doctrine emphasized systematic evacuation, establish priorities, maintain order, control the process. The Kerch operation proved that rigid systems collapsed when German pressure accelerated faster than procedures could adapt. Bychevsky's scheduled departures worked during initial phases when Soviet forces maintained defensive perimeters. Once those lines broke, fixed schedules became death traps. Troops arrived at embarkation points in wrong order and wrong numbers. Vessels departed partially loaded because scheduled units hadn't arrived, or overloaded because unscheduled units swarmed the docks. The ferry bottleneck created a tactical vulnerability. German commanders quickly recognized that 4 kilometers of open water represented the perfect kill zone. Soviet forces had to cross. They couldn't detour, couldn't find alternate routes, couldn't avoid exposure. Luftwaffe pilots learned to time attacks for maximum impact, hit vessels mid-crossing when they couldn't maneuver, strike docks during loading when troops stood exposed, target the eastern shore, where evacuated forces concentrated. But the operational impact extended beyond immediate casualties. The Kerch disaster forced Soviet High Command to reconsider defensive strategies in Crimea. After losing 250,000 troops, 130,000 captured, 52,000 killed during evacuation, 68,000 killed in combat. Stalin recognized that defending forward positions created opportunities for catastrophic encirclement. Better to withdraw earlier, preserve forces, trade space for time. This strategic shift influenced Soviet operations throughout 1942 and into 1943, where defensive lines became more fluid and commanders received greater authority to retreat before encirclement became inevitable. German forces drew different conclusions. Manstein's rapid penetration at Kerch demonstrated the effectiveness of concentrated armor against overextended Soviet positions. The operation became a model for future offensives. Identify weak points, commit armor aggressively, exploit breakthroughs before defenders could establish secondary lines. Wehrmacht training materials used Kerch as a case study in successful mobile operations through 1943. What about the ferries themselves? The remaining vessels continued operating throughout 1942, supporting Soviet forces in the Caucasus. But procedures changed fundamentally. Post-Kerch regulations prohibited rigid scheduling. Instead, ferry commanders received discretion to load opportunistically. Any troops who reached embarkation points could board regardless of planned priorities. Maximum capacity limits became enforced strictly after multiple overload disasters. Night operations became mandatory doctrine rather than adaptive response. Soviet engineering corps studied the evacuation's technical failures. The primary lesson: ferry capacity couldn't match evacuation requirements when forces compressed into small pockets. Future defensive planning incorporated this constraint. If positions couldn't be held, commanders should withdraw before German forces could trap large formations. Better to abandon territory intact than attempt desperate evacuations under fire. The Kerch Strait itself became a permanent operational feature. Soviet forces fortified the eastern shore with coastal artillery and air defense positions. They never again attempted defending the western shore without maintaining secure ferry corridors. The strait represented both vulnerability and security. Vulnerable when retreating across it, secure once forces reached the Caucasus side. Did the ferry system's architect survive to apply his lessons? Colonel Pyotr Bychevsky continued serving in engineering roles throughout the war. He never commanded another evacuation. His superiors recognized his organizational skills, but understood that systematic procedures worked poorly under chaos. Bychevsky spent 1943-1945 building defensive fortifications and bridge infrastructure, tasks where rigid planning created success rather than catastrophe. He retired in 1947 with multiple decorations, including the Order of Lenin for his Kerch service. The citation never mentioned the 52,000 casualties his procedures helped create. Captain Grigory Suslov, who commanded receiving operations at Chushka Spit, remained at that post through summer 1942. His dock complex continued processing evacuees from Crimean operations until September, when Soviet forces stabilized their lines. He transferred to Logistics Command in the North Caucasus, where his experience managing chaos under pressure proved valuable during Stalingrad's encirclement. Suslov survived the war, though he rarely discussed the Kerch evacuation. Senior Lieutenant Vasily Markov, the supply officer who'd watched his regiment dissolve during the retreat, reached the Caucasus with 140 survivors from his original company of 480. He received promotion to captain in command of a rebuilt supply unit. Markov fought through the Caucasus campaign, then participated in the liberation of Ukraine and Poland. He died during the Battle of Berlin, April 1945, killed by German artillery 3 weeks before victory. He was 32. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Kozlov's body was recovered after German forces withdrew from Kerch in 1943. Soviet authorities identified him through documents in his uniform. He received posthumous recognition as Hero of the Soviet Union. The citation cited his courage, maintaining ferry operations under fire. It never mentioned that his rigid scheduling probably trapped more soldiers than it saved. Captain Alexei Kravchenko, the medium barge commander who survived multiple attacks, continued ferry operations into 1943. His shoulder wound from the final Kerch crossing healed poorly, leaving limited mobility in his left arm. He transferred to training command, teaching ferry tactics to new crews. His lessons emphasized flexibility over procedure, adapt to conditions, prioritize survival over schedule, accept chaos as operational reality. Kravchenko's students applied those principles during later operations, improving evacuation success rates significantly. Could anything have prevented the catastrophe? Post-war analysis suggested alternative approaches. Withdraw earlier before German forces closed within artillery range. Establish multiple evacuation points to distribute risk. Maintain larger ferry reserves to absorb losses. Accept equipment abandonment to prioritize personnel. Every suggestion shared common recognition. The Kerch disaster resulted from attempting systematic control when chaos demanded adaptive response. The Kerch Peninsula evacuation remained Soviet military history's largest maritime disaster, more casualties than any other naval engagement on the Eastern Front. Those 52,000 deaths purchased escape for 119,000 survivors. Whether that exchange rate justified the attempt remained unanswerable. The soldiers who drowned in the strait left no testimony about their final moments. The ones who survived rarely discussed what they witnessed. The silence spoke clearly enough. May 8th, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Kozlov watched ammunition barges sink in Kerch Harbor. He believed systematic organization would solve the problem. 10 days later, he died on the dock he'd tried to manage, killed by the chaos his procedures couldn't control. His legacy lived in revised Soviet doctrine that finally recognized what Kerch taught through blood. Sometimes survival demands accepting disorder rather than imposing order. The lesson cost 52,000 lives to learn. Whether anyone truly learned it remained uncertain.